Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. We hope today's session will be as informational and relevant as we'd want it to be. So I'm Robert Naouss, RELX International's External Affairs Director for the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe regions. I am joined by my colleague, Donald Graff, who is Head of Scientific Affairs for North America at RELX International, and then the popular, without any introduction, John Dunne, Director General of the UK Vaping Industry Association, the UKVIA. First, let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so this is the title of our session, our webinar. We're going to start with a quick intro about our company, RELX International, its vision and mission before we venture into the session's topics. So RELX International was founded back in 2019 by RELX brand co-founder Bing Du, and the company opened its first overseas store in Toronto, Canada in July that year. So RELX International currently sells RELX branded e-cigarette products in numerous countries around the world, including the UK, Russia, Canada, New Zealand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and recently the United Arab Emirates, where I'm based basically. In June 2020, RELX International launched the RELX Infinity device for global markets. RELX's mission is to provide science-backed and cutting-edge vaping products for adult smokers out there who are looking to switch to better alternatives than cigarettes. We harness the potential of innovation and design, and this is basically Donald's part, science and technology in order to deliver products of utmost quality, highest standards, and reliability and safety mechanisms. Moving on, this is the agenda, where I will be covering the first three topics, then followed by Donald, who will take us through the science of harm reduction, after which John will discuss regulatory role when it comes to promoting tobacco and nicotine harm reduction, followed by concluding remarks also by John, and then the Q&A. So we begin with a quick intro about harm reduction in terms of definition and where and how it is applied. So I'm going to start here with what Scott Bollard, who is US Director of the Alliance for Health, Economic, and Agricultural Development, who defines harm reduction as follows. So the concept of and application of science-based harm reduction strategies is something that we use and live with every day of our lives. Automobile, motorcycle, airplane safety, curtailing AIDS and other STDs, environmental pollution in many forms, food safety, nutrition, the list goes on and on. And it is critical that we look seriously at the huge potential public health benefits that can be obtained by putting in place a global product regulatory system that will give millions of people science-based options for reducing disease and death caused by smoking. I took this quote from Clive Bates' website, basically. Now, also in that same vein, the Australian government's Department of Health defines harm reduction as a philosophy that focuses on preventing and or reducing the harm associated with potentially risky activities and not on preventing people from performing such activities. So the harm reduction approach acknowledges that it can be more effective for individuals and communities to reduce the harms associated with specific harmful habits and product use. And although the term is of relatively recent origin, in the last 20 years, harm reduction has been practiced throughout history to address many different problems. Again, this is from the Australian government's Department of Health. On this note, we will go through a few examples to illustrate where and how the principle of harm reduction was used across various fields and industries, among which we will discuss e-scooters, which will take the biggest chunk of my section here, and then seatbelts and helmets, as well as condom use and STDs. Starting with e-scooters, it's important here to note that as long as new products and services are not specifically limited by regulations, they spread to wherever there is demand for them. And again, this has been the case for e-scooters, which offer a novel solution for getting around congested cities. I mean, less effort than a bicycle, obviously, more convenience or more convenient than buses, and definitely less polluting than cars. Now, city and national authorities were having to play catch up, more or less, drafting regulations to keep the mobility benefits of e-scooters while reducing the nuisance and risks of injury they can cause. That's also been the case with rideshare platforms such as Uber and Lyft, for example, which in theory help to improve traffic flow, save money, and reduce environmental impact, as well as with Airbnb as another example, which enables travelers and hosts to arrange short-term stays. Now, in both cases, local and national authorities have had to examine the knock-on effects of these new services and decide on regulations to minimize the negatives while trying to retain the positives. Now, from a regulatory perspective, e-cigarettes are in a similar situation to e-scooters. They are arguably the first breakthrough innovation in their industry, so the tobacco and nicotine industry, for many decades, and they represent a possible better way forward. However, while these products arguably can present a better alternative to continued smoking, they have also triggered legitimate concerns, from questionable safety and reliability and quality standards for some products to their use by unintended audiences, such as minors, former smokers, non-smokers, etc. For example, in the US, the media have widely reported on valid concerns around youth uptake of these products. Now, during 2019, on the same note, perceptions of both e-scooters and e-cigarettes were influenced by negative events that prompted scary headlines. Now, in the case of e-scooters, there have been sporadic reports of accidents and fatalities in various cities around the world. Now, to date, there has been no wide-scale collation of those instances. However, from a media and public perception perspective, those other modes of transport, such as, for example, buses, bikes, motorbikes, public transportation, these are familiar. You know, so they are their risk is sort of accepted in a way. By contrast, e-scooters are new and unfamiliar, so any injuries or bad practices involving them tend to generate eye-catching, scare stories. And this is, you know, the point that I'm trying to relate to e-cigarettes here. Now, on e-scooters again, a case in point is the July 2019 death of British TV presenter Emily Hartridge in London. This appears to have been the first e-scooter fatality in the UK, and it made high impact news as far away as California. So the first e-scooter share schemes were rolled out in San Francisco, Washington, DC, and Los Angeles without regulatory approval. The backlash from local governments was swift, as authorities were flooded with public complaints. Some cities responded by issuing temporary bans, and the ban was introduced in the UK, up until electric scooters became legal on roads in England, Scotland, and Wales in July 2020, if obtained through a ride-sharing scheme. Now, in terms of regulations here, the scooters will be limited to traveling at 15.5 miles per hour and banned on pavements. Riders will need to be aged 16 or over and have a full or provisional driving license. Now, within that same topic, we go to France, where Paris alone has more than 20,000 e-scooters, and it previously had an open door policy to e-scooter share services. However, in June, it introduced speed limits, parking rules, and restricted the number of operators to 3, along with the overall number of e-scooters. This is emerging as the default regulatory mode, which is to have 2 or 3 operators in a city. Now, in September, however, that year, France's Transport Ministry went a step further, where it banned e-scooters on sidewalks, along with other regulations that were put in place. Municipal facilities in every city have quickly learned that they need to put in regulatory environments that do not suppress innovation or choice for citizens, which is something that applies also to other industries as well. Now, moving on to the second point, which is seatbelts and helmets. The objective here is to reduce fatalities and injuries resulting from driving. And here we will refer to a study that was published in the Journal of Safety Research back in 2007, where it states that it stated that among drivers and front seat passengers, seat belts reduce the risk of death by 45% and cut the risk of serious injury by 50%. The study adds that seat belts saved almost 13,000 lives in 2009. If all drivers and passengers had worn seat belts that year, almost 4,000 more people would be alive today. That same study concludes by stating that seat belts have saved an estimated 255,000 lives since 1975. So the outcome here is that helmet laws and seatbelt laws reduce motorcycle accident fatalities and severe injuries, and fatality rates are 31% lower among motorcyclists of 15 to 20 years of age. Again, quoting this study from Science Direct. Lastly, Thailand's condom use programs. The objective was to implement a successful harm reduction strategy to reduce prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases. So for that, Thailand instituted a harm reduction strategy in 1991, in which all sex workers and sex establishments had to use condoms with clients. Health officials provided free condoms, and local police even went to holding meetings with sex establishment owners and sex workers despite the illegality of prostitution. Now, the outcome is that by 1995, HIV incidence among young men in northern Thailand declined nearly 5-fold, and the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases decreased 10-fold. All of this goes to show how harm reduction can be applied to various industries with successful rates and outcomes here and there. Now, moving forward to our next topic, which is tobacco harm reduction. Here, in addition to this statement taken from a letter on tobacco harm reduction addressed to former WHO General Manager or Director General Margaret Chan, we will also reference a statement by Dr. Moonol Yikun, who is a leading Korean professor of public health from Seoul National University. He says that alongside government efforts to prevent initiation of tobacco use and encourage smokers to quit, a growing number of public health authorities and experts now believe that giving smokers access to less harmful alternatives can be a major benefit to public health. Their approach is often referred to as tobacco harm reduction. He goes on adding, we should adopt the harm reduction approach and actively prepare to research and regulate less harmful tobacco products that can reduce the harm due to smoking for the people in Korea who cannot or will not quit smoking or quit cigarettes. On this same note, prominent harm reduction advocate Clive Bates talks about two conditions for achieving public health benefits. And this part will be further elaborated on by Donald in the science section. Anyway, so Clive Bates mentions that, according to its supporters, tobacco harm reduction can play a role for public health if new products are developed that meet two conditions. First, they need to present less risk than continued cigarette use, so lower risk profile. Second, they should be satisfying enough so that adult smokers switch to them. Again, Donald will discuss this in more detail in his part. Now, the next subsection here would address key attributes of reduced harm alternatives to cigarettes. So although nicotine is naturally produced by tobacco, experts agree that nicotine, while addictive, is not the primary cause of smoking-related diseases. The UK's Royal College of Physicians states that nicotine itself is not especially hazardous, and if nicotine could be provided in a form that is acceptable and effective as a cigarette substitute, millions of lives could be saved. As a result, the toxic compounds that are found in cigarette smoke, which are the result of combustion, so most of which are formed when the cigarette is lit or burned, these are recognized as the harmful constituents that are the primary constituents that are the primary cause of smoking-related diseases. And here too, Jean-François Adab, who is professor of public health and leading Swiss tobacco control researcher, he adds, saying that cigarette combustion, rather than either tobacco or nicotine, is the cause of a public health disaster. The combustion process produces many toxic compounds that are not found in unburned tobacco. Moving on, and the last subtopic here will tackle how the public and private sectors see a public health opportunity for new nicotine products. So governments can play a key role by appropriately encouraging the innovation, scientific assessment, and promotion of less harmful alternatives for adult smokers. The US and the EU, among others, have already adopted or are in the process of adopting frameworks for alternatives to cigarettes. Here I'm going to reference Public Health England's 7th independent report on vaping in England, which was carried out by researchers at King's College London, which found that nicotine vaping products were the most popular aid used by smokers trying to quit in England in 2020. Second, it is estimated that in 2017, more than 50,000 smokers stopped smoking with the aid of a vaping product who would otherwise have carried on smoking. Third, using a vaping product as part of a quit attempt in local stop smoking services had some of the highest quit success rates, between 59.7% and 74% in 2019 and 2020. The same report takes an in-depth look at the latest evidence on the effectiveness of nicotine vaping products in helping people to stop smoking. It provides an update on the use of nicotine vaping products among young people and adults and examines the data on people's perception of risk. Now, in England in 2020, nicotine vaping products were the most popular aid used by smokers trying to quit, with 27.2% of smokers using a vaping product compared with 18.2% using nicotine replacement therapy products such as nicotine patches, gum, spray, etc., and 4.4% using a prescription, the prescription medicine varenicline. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly. Now, in line with this report, Professor John Newton, Director of Health Improvement at Public Health England, said, smoking is still the leading preventable cause of premature death and disease, killing almost 75,000 people in England in 2019 alone. The best thing that a smoker can do is to stop smoking completely, and the evidence shows that vaping is one of the most effective quit aids available, helping around 50,000 smokers quit each year. And thousands more obviously could have quit, except for unfounded safety fears about e-cigarettes, which is, again, a topic on its own. So the evidence has been clear for some time that while not risk-free, vaping is far less harmful than smoking. And here, Public Health England's advice remains that smokers should switch to vaping products to help them quit smoking. And PHE has also commissioned a full review of the evidence on the safety of vaping products, which will be published next year in 2022. King's College London is here working with a number of different researchers from the UK and the US to conduct this review. And on this front, Professor Anne McNeil, who is a professor for tobacco addiction at King's College London and lead author of the report, she said that the report draws together findings from randomized controlled trials, stop smoking services, and population studies, and concludes that nicotine vaping products are an effective way of successfully quitting smoking. She adds that what is concerning is that smokers, particularly those from disadvantaged groups, incorrectly and increasingly believe that vaping is as harmful as smoking. This is simply not true, I'm still quoting her here, and means fewer smokers try vaping. Now, the goal for 2030 is to be smoke-free in England. The development of a new tobacco control plan and this year's review of the Tobacco and Related Products Regulation, the TRPR, is an opportunity to ensure that regulations around vaping are appropriate. The regulations are also hoped to help smokers to quit while not attracting people who have never smoked. In that same vein, on harm reduction policies, and the US FDA's modified risk tobacco product application guidance for industry, the agency states that harm reduction policies may be valuable tools in the effort to promote public health by reducing the morbidity and mortality associated with tobacco use, particularly if companies take advantage of these provisions by making bold, innovative product changes. And here, as for the nicotine and tobacco industry's role, and this is my last subsection, some public health advocates who have long opposed smoking now believe that the tobacco industry can also play a role in reducing the harm of smoking by developing and bringing to market less harmful alternatives to cigarettes, many of which are doing that already, be it through heat-not-burn or e-cigarettes and other product range or product portfolio. Here, leading global harm reduction advocate Jerry Stimson comments by saying that we need to create a situation in which there are incentives for tobacco companies to gradually become nicotine companies, that their long-term profits are going to be in other products than cigarettes. And this is what many of those companies are already investing in and venturing into. And here also, to conclude my section, I will quote Derek Yack, who is the former head of the WHO for Tobacco Control, who during his speech in 2015 at the Global Forum on Nicotine said, the more we can turn the pledges of intent into actual numbers that can be independently verified, the more I think we'll have an assurance that many of these companies are serious about the long term. And that would be the end of this section. And now we move on to the science and harm reduction part. And here I give the floor to Donald.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, today I'm just going to touch on some examples of the scientific data that's available on ENDS products so that we're able to use those or demonstrate that they can be useful to support the concept of tobacco harm reduction. And on this first slide, I'm not going to cover this. I think we're all aware of the risks of smoking and the harms that it can cause both at the individual and societal level. I do want to point out one very well-known quote in this area from Professor Michael Russell that dates back, I think, to about 1976, which states that people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. And so, while, as Robert pointed out, nicotine is not entirely benign. It's really the exposure to the tar that contains the thousands of nasty toxicants that are known to lead to smoking-related disease. So then, to relieve this burden, what we really need to do is find ways to transition smokers away from combustible cigarettes, and that's where these products really come in. Robert, go ahead and advance to the next one. So there's just a couple of basic principles I want to outline off the top. These are really based in toxicology. So how harm reduction can be calculated or estimated. While these equations are very much simplified, they do demonstrate the principles quite nicely. So first, we need to understand harm itself. So from a toxicology point of view, harm can roughly be estimated as the level of risk of something multiplied by the dose or the exposure level, either at the population or individual level. So one might envision a chemical or activity that can carry with it a large degree of harm if it has a high enough level of toxicity or danger, even if the dose is very low or the event is very rare. And on the other hand, even exposure to something with a low level of toxicity, something thought of as benign as even water, can carry some degree of harm if the dose or exposure level is high enough. And so then to sort of advance this to the concept of tobacco harm reduction, we look at the second equation here, and this is taken from something that Clive Bates also put together many years ago, where greater harm reduction can be achieved by reducing the relative risk or toxicity of the alternative product compared to combustible cigarettes, and then multiplying it by the number of people who switch to it. And so here on this side of the equation, you can see that the switching component is really made up of two parts. So to be of the greatest benefit, we want to maximize the switch rate of the target population, and which in this case is obviously smokers. while minimizing the uptake and use by unintended populations. So people, former smokers, people who've never smoked, and of course, youth. And so there really is a balancing act here with regard to product appeal that needs to be taken into account when we think in terms of harm reduction. And the second concept here I just want to briefly touch on is there's a widely recognized continuum of risk associated with products that contain nicotine, with combustible cigarettes obviously carrying the highest risk, and demonstrated here on the right side of the figure, and medicinal nicotine replacement therapy such as gums, patches, lozenges carrying the lowest risk. And of course, between those two ends of the spectrum, we have lots of other products, heat not burn products, traditional smokeless products, vapor and modern oral nicotine products. And so while the figure here isn't necessarily to scale, of course, the idea or the concept from a health perspective is to move consumers from the high risk end down the continuum to the lower risk end, and even completely off of all products if they choose. And so, Robert, if you want to advance to the next one. There we go. So how can vaping products potentially contribute to tobacco harm reduction? Well, first it starts with the development of high quality liquids and devices, and production under good manufacturing practices. And so as Robert mentioned at the top, as a manufacturer at RELX, we do have state-of-the-art R&D facilities where we design vaping products to meet the standards, or meet high standards and the needs of smokers looking for alternatives to combustible cigarettes. And we start by choosing only high quality materials and components to use in the manufacturing process, because it's so important to start with quality ingredients. The standards that we have at RELX also include a long series of QC steps, including thorough inspection of the incoming materials, testing of the various components and characteristics during the production process, and then a thorough inspection prior to shipment to ensure that the consumers have the highest quality and reliable products to use in their vaping experience. And this really can't be, quality at this point really can't be stressed enough, because as we saw in the US Valley situation here a few years ago, which was found to be driven by illicit THC products and not nicotine vaping products, production of these products that doesn't follow strict quality standards certainly can have dire consequences. Okay, Robert, go ahead to the next one. So beyond the impact of development manufacturing to these high standards, there's a growing body of evidence to demonstrate that as a category, vaping products can carry low levels of exposure to many toxicants found in cigarette smoke that are known to contribute to cancer and other diseases. The study that I show here summarizes data from exclusive smokers, dual users, that is, people who smoke and use e-cigarette products, exclusive e-cigarette users, and then non-users. And this is data that was collected from consumers in the US, the UK, as well as Poland. And so what these researchers found was that exclusive e-cigarette consumers tended to have lower exposure to many of the toxicants found in cigarette smoke, with many found at the same level as people who didn't use tobacco products at all. In addition, the researchers also found that dual users of combustible cigarettes and e-cigarettes had lower exposure to some toxicants compared to exclusive smokers, and similar levels of other toxicants. And what these investigators and others have demonstrated in studies like this is that the reduction potential is really related to the number of cigarettes that are smoked, and not necessarily what's coming from the vaping products. And so this is just one of many. There's numerous studies that have demonstrated reductions like this, and even some that have shown that the reductions can be exceeded, those that compared to what we see here, with in many cases reduction of the toxicants, 85, 90, 95%, with a complete transition away from combustible cigarettes. So clearly clearly there's a great potential here to have a positive impact when smokers switch. Okay, Robert. With data like this, after evaluating some of these kinds of studies, some health authorities have caught on and made some statements as to the potential for e-cigarettes to provide benefit relative to the harm of smoking. And Robert pointed a couple of these out. I just want to point out there was the French Federation of Addictology that stated that e-cigarettes can be a complementary tool to significantly reduce the harmful effects of tobacco combustion. And then, as Robert pointed out, the now very famous Public Health England statement, which estimated that e-cigarettes can be at least 95% less harmful than smoking. Now, to be clear, though, that this doesn't mean that these products are harmless. Almost nothing is completely free of harm, but certainly in comparison to combustible cigarettes, there's ample evidence to suggest that these products carry reduced harm potential. Okay, go ahead. The next, there we go. And Robert also touched on a little bit of what's presented here. So I won't rehash everything. Just to mention that a recent Eurobarometer report noted that of respondents who responded to this, 11% of subjects reported, or respondents reported using vaping devices, compared to 13% who reported using NRT products such as gum, the patch, and inhaler. So truly, people are attempting to use these products in their cessation attempt. Robert covered the Vape, the Public Health England report there very well, so I won't rehash all of that. But I did want to point out one item. And if I'm interpreting this correctly, and I think this came from an ASH study, consumers were finding success rates, upwards of 60% when using a vaping product with licensed medication at the same time, vaping product alone, and varenicline alone. Again, about 60% success rates there. But if I interpreted, sorry, it's a little early here. If I interpreted the report correctly, only about 11% of the local services in England were offering vaping products. So if correct, that seems to be pretty remarkable in that, they provide a large number of consumers with a great amount of success, but we're only offered at a very, very low rate. Okay, this is my last content slide here. So what we've seen is that ENDS have reduced toxicity potential compared to combustible cigarettes, and that at least some smokers can successfully use these products to quit or cut back on their smoking habits. But what does it all mean in terms of harm reduction? And so the study that I'm referencing here, researchers in the US built a mathematical model to evaluate the impact of a hypothetical substitution of vaping products for cigarettes compared to a scenario where vaping products were not allowed. And what they found was that current US cigarette and vaping product use and substitution rates, and again, assuming a 5% relative risk as shown in the Public Health England report, compared to smoking, that vaping products could lead to nearly 2 million fewer premature deaths and nearly 40 million fewer life years lost in the US alone between 2013 and 2060. So obviously there's a huge potential here to have a positive impact on the public health. And so by adjusting the inputs into models like this, as conditions and regulations change, for example, researchers could estimate the potential impact on public health by changing some of the transitions that might occur if, for example, flavor bans were put into place or nicotine caps were put into place. So these types of models can be very useful to estimate the potential impact on public health. Okay, and I just want to leave with a couple of conclusion statements here. To save a little bit of time, I won't talk about these. I think some of this is probably going to be covered by John, but certainly, you know, at the end of this, if there are any questions on this, I'm happy to respond.
Okay. Thank you so much, Donald. Thanks again. And I know that it's 6 a.m. your time. Now it's 6:30 a.m. So thank you for taking the time to attend this session. It was certainly enriching, interactive, and highly beneficial. So now we move on to John Dunne, the role of regulators. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. Much appreciated. And thanks, Donald, for taking us through some of the science around electronic cigarettes and their success. Now, what can regulators do? You know, regulators, I think, around the world are scrambling to keep up with the pace of change and innovation within our industry. But regulation should really be based on solid science, reasonable and proportionate regulations in proportion to risk. And it's really about balancing the need for innovation and other societal benefits with concerns around safety. And this can be a difficult task, you know, to achieve. But this is where novel nicotine products such as e-cigarettes have a role to play in public health. While it's best to obviously quit or never start smoking, smokers who don't have the right access to choose the products that are affordable and effective for them really is hurting their chances of success in moving away from combustible tobacco. You know, safer alternatives should be available wherever combustible tobacco products are. And I think furthermore, you know, it is key to enable access not only to both information and the products. If adult smokers can't access the products, then they'll not be able to use them, and therefore the opportunity to achieve harm reduction at a societal level will be squandered. So what's important here is to challenge the misconceptions and the misinformation while opening minds to what science, technology, and design have made available in terms of products to adult smokers looking to make better alternatives. So such new products have enormous potential if they receive the support needed from governments and regulatory bodies, as we have had here in the UK. And we can't allow moral or ideological divisiveness and misinformation to prevent that, you know, what is undoubtedly one of the greatest public health opportunities of the century. It's a public health prize really just waiting to be won. And to this end, the UKVIA members, such as RELX, have proposed a roadmap for progressive and liberal regulations. And some of the key areas that we looked at was allowing vape retailers to communicate and offer services to adult smokers by allowing pre-approved switching messages to be placed on vaping products, but more importantly, inside tobacco products. Adopting packaging, labeling, and flavor names, limiting references to youth culture is extremely important. And strengthening the current standards on e-liquid to cover all liquids used in vaping devices. And also maintaining high quality controls in the manufacturing process, such as we've talked about before. And it's really interesting to highlight RELX's 18-step quality control process. Now, the UKVIA has been working with associations around the world and recently formed a global alliance with one of China's largest trade associations and trade bodies there, the ECCC. And I think it's really important for the industry globally to continue to share best practices and information to ensure that our products are as reliable and safe for public consumption as possible. So if we go to the next slide, please, Robert.
Yes. Sorry.
Then we go back to.
Yeah, because we're discussing the roadmap. After that, we have the closing remarks.
I'm missing a slide then. The UK embraces e-cigs away. That one?
Yeah, that's one.
That's one there. You know, as we talked about before, you know, vaping helps between 50 to 70,000 people, smokers in England quit every year. And it's really important to remember that's 200 people per day in the UK are dying from smoking related illnesses. And this is something that we can't put up with. Now, the study found that the success rate for people quitting smoking rose as the use of e-cigarettes increased from 2011 onwards. As we pointed out a number of times, excuse me, and as we pointed out a number of times, Public Health England continues to reiterate its statement that vaping is 95% less harmful than smoking. We go to the next slide, please. And for the first time, you know, we've seen current e-cigarettes have declined year on year from 7.1% to 6.3% of the adult population in Great Britain. And that's critical to look at regulations and, again, looking at that misinformation that's going around about vaping. You know, we've seen these numbers greatly being impacted by news from the US around the misinformation around the Valley, for instance. But that's just one example of the amount of money and resources being put against vaping in the world. Over half, or 58.9% of current vapers are ex-smokers, and that proportion has grown year on year. Now, what's important there is that one of the misinformations that we get about vaping is that it's a gateway to smoking. Well, in fact, all of the data points to the opposite direction. The proportion of adult smokers who have never tried e-cigarettes, you know, fell rapidly between 2010 until 2014. And continued falling, but gradually from 2015 onwards, and in 2020, it was 32.4%. Now, only 0.3% of never smokers are current vapers, and that's really a small amount. So, you know, we hear a huge amount of media stories talking about, you know, the youth vaping epidemic or non-smokers taking up vaping, and that really isn't the case. But that's not what regulators around the world understand, and that's not what the media are reporting. So it's extremely important that we keep on. So we go to the next slide, please. And this will just show you, you know, exactly the growth of the vaping rates here in the UK. You know, as it continues to grow, you see that subsequent decline in smoking rates. And as we see in the bottom of the graph here, the amount of never smokers in the UK is completely on the decline and is extremely low. So when I look at reports, for instance, coming out specifically from the US, talking about things like a youth vaping epidemic, the numbers really just don't support that argument. If we go to the next slide, please. So some areas that we also look at is around different reports from around the world. And the British Medical Journal showed a substantial increase in e-cigarette use among the US adult smokers. And that was associated again with that statistically significant increase in the smoking cessation rate. And that's also borne out in Sweden, for instance, where, you know, the use of other novel tobacco-related products such as snus has really had a huge effect on reducing the smoking rates in Sweden. So it's extremely important that governments around the world really take a close look at the science behind vaping and other novel tobacco products, because if they don't, what my fear is that the smoking rates will actually slow down, the quit rates will slow down, and people may turn back to smoking regular cigarettes, as we've seen happen in certain areas of the US, where things, for instance, like flavor bans have been introduced, and people do return back to smoking.
we take a look at the next slide, please, Robert?
I think this next slide is a part I wanted to quickly discuss. Okay. Thank you so much, John. Again, this is just like a small interruption here. I just wanted to outline the Guardian program, which is something that we take pride in RELX. As John rightfully mentioned, regulations need to also take into account the need to minimize any potential repercussions, and that, targeting unintended audiences and so on, which is as important as securing or adopting differential regulations when it comes to vaping versus cigarettes. And here, since its inception, our company has paid the greatest attention to youth access prevention, and this is where the pioneering, I would say, Guardian program comes in. It involves a series of measures to prevent minors from buying and using e-cigarette products, and to educate adult smokers to abstain from using e-cigs in front of minors. So this company-wide initiative stretches from product development to sales, preventing and discouraging the use of e-cigs by minors through concerted efforts with retailers to step up on-site identification, alongside warnings such as keep away from minors being printed on the packaging of all RELX International products. All RELX branded stores as well are required to follow strict operational guidelines, including displaying clear warning posters indicating that our products are not for sale to minors. We also adopt a strict penalty system on retailers and shop operators who violate these guidelines. Lastly, on this point, we are an active member of the UKVIA's Youth Access Prevention Committee, which John just referenced. And a few photos here of a retail engagement program that's taking place in Asia, in several Asian markets now, and will be rolled out across the UK and other markets as we progress. This is basically made up of a retail brochure on guiding retailers on how to say no to potential minors trying to buy nicotine products, why they should, do responsible marketing or commercialization. In addition to posters, stickers, wobblers, etc., all over their stores, on the need to sell these products only for adult smokers and those who provide valid identification and so on. So this is the roadmap that John has spoke about earlier, and we have the closing remarks. I don't know, John, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to.
Yeah, I think I think one of the biggest things that we've got to look at, as you've mentioned, is responsible marketing and responsibility for youth access in the entire chain, and that goes from product development through manufacturing, through working with distributors, all the way to the consumer. And I think every company and every individual along that journey really has a responsibility to ensure that their products are of the highest standard, that their marketing is responsible and in line with all of the regulations. And I think it's responsible then for the retailers themselves to ensure that they're not selling products to young people. I think that's critical if the industry is to be seen as being self-governing and as being responsible for the long-term growth. So that's about my summing up of it.
Thank you so much, John. Really excellent presentation and intervention. And thank you as well, Donald, for first for waking up so early for this, and for also taking us through the ins and outs of the science of harm reduction. I think with this closing session, where we're open for Q&A, I'm just gonna stop sharing the screen and open the Q&A section to check whether there are any answers. No answers here, no questions. I will take that as a compliment that you were very clear in the presentation. Okay, I think with this, we will conclude our seminar. Thank you everyone for whoever tuned in, and we'll see you on another occasion. Thanks again, Don. Thank you, John, and have a lovely rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, John.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.